Uh, Hello, good evening. Welcome to this special introductory lecture. It's an introductory lecture because Taras Fedirko, who's going to deliver it, was recently joined the IWM as a senior research fellow. Otherwise, he's an assistant professor at the School of Social and Political Science in Glasgow, and having received his doctorate at Durham University, he has held postdoctoral research positions in Cambridge, England that is, and St Andrews, and for accuracy's sake, Scotland. St Andrews in Scotland. So, Taras does particularly interesting work about which we're going to hear about. The title of his lecture is The World That Drone Wars Made, War Economies and the Remaking of Political Order. So this is an extremely actual subject that you're tackling, and after you've delivered your lecture, which will be about 45-50 minutes, we'll have time for questions, and then everyone is warmly welcomed downstairs for the post-lecture wine and cheese. But Taras, please take the stage. And
thank you, Misha, and good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. I mean, I think the advertisement for the talk should have mentioned the brilliant AC that we have here, because maybe more people would have come, but then it would have been less comfortable. It's a delight to be able to speak on this topic, particularly because the research project out of which it emerges took shape, and at least thanks to the IWM and IWM's support financially, and IWM's visiting fellowship that I held a couple of years back. This is a good occasion to try to introduce the kind of broader project that is emerging out of this work. And I hope we'll have an interesting conversation about this. I have to say and confess as an academic that it's an unusual way of engaging on the subject for me, because I'm used to the minutiae of academic debate, and today I'll be trying to do something else. I'll be trying to tell a story, or several stories, and they're messy, and that's really the danger, that it will be too messy. But let's see. And in this spirit, I want to begin by reciting part of a famous poem, which I'll do badly, but I'll try. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. W.B. Yeats wrote The Second Coming in January 1919 on the ruins of old European order. The Great War had just ended, and by 1919, 3 of the empires that had waged the war had collapsed. The British had emerged victorious, yet much weakened, and Yeats' native Ireland was about to descend into a new war. The Russian Revolution to the east posed a challenge to regimes old and new far beyond Eastern Europe, and other revolutions were afoot, including in my native Ukraine. It is this sense of unrest and of what might come out of it that the poem expresses so well. And it is perhaps for its apocalyptic prophecy of a new order emerging out of the crisis of wars, revolutions, and pandemics that so many have turned to the poem ever since. Now, when Sierra Leone's foreign minister, Timothy Musakaba, recited the poem's first stanza, as I have just done, at the United Nations gathering in New York this last May, he stepped into a long tradition of using Yeats' Second Coming as a foil and a warning. Others before him, notably Chinua Achebe and Joan Didion, Stephen King and Slavoj Žižek, even Jordan Peterson, and even a character from The Sopranos, can't remember which one, had plundered it for memorable lines, as did a book published by the Brookings Institution in 2007 that warned of the things imminently falling apart in the US-occupied Iraq. And Yeats, by the way, was not the only inspiration for the book's authors. Misha's The Fall of Yugoslavia supplied them useful material for imagining how civil wars can transform regional orders. But Kaba brought something new to this long lineage of honoring and misusing Yeats. The meeting where he spoke was an informal UN consultation on lethal autonomous weapon systems, laws. The falcon that cannot hear the falconer made for a particularly potent image for the AI-powered military drone, the paradigmatic example of an autonomous weapon and a core concern for many delegates in the meeting. In the 8 years that UN member states have sought and failed to elaborate principles for regulating killer robots, hear about the best who lacked all convictions, there has been a revolution in the use of small drones on the battlefield and in the capacity of these flying machines to make relatively autonomous decisions about the use of lethal force. Central to this revolution have been the fields and towns of East Ukraine, in the battles for which new forms of drone warfare have emerged and become increasingly automated. From Myanmar to Syria to Sudan, the tactical skills and technical know-how tested in Ukraine have proliferated, transforming threats to civilians and generating new forms of death. New globalized supply chains of violence have likewise underpinned this revolution, connecting the laboratory of Ukrainian battlefields to software companies in Lviv, Munich, and Arlington, to propeller and chip manufacturers in China and Taiwan, to users further afield. This, we often hear, is the future of war, a fundamental shift in the evolution of lethal force. In this future, the rise of automation is made possible, supposedly made possible, by the proliferation of small and crude systems on land, in the air, in the sea, and by corresponding efforts to make them impervious to jamming and other forms of disruption, which fuels this relentless cycle of innovation on the front lines. Summarizing one moderate version of this military futurism, the British defense intellectual Lawrence Freedman, helpfully yesterday on Substack, recently wrote that those who imagine drones as the future of war expect to see them performing an increasing range of tasks as a relatively inexpensive way of finding and hitting distant targets. And Friedman is skeptical of this vision, and he says that drones should be seen in context, but that's a side point. This expectation has become generalized into a guidance for the transformation of defense industries and military force the world over. We must recognize, wrote Prime Minister Keir Starmer in the preface to UK's recent Strategic Defence Review, that, quote, the very nature of warfare is being transformed on the battlefields of Ukraine, and we must adapt our armed forces and our industry to lead this innovation. So we must learn. Those critical of this future of war, of what this future of war may hold for us, such as campaigners opposing the use of killer robots, point out that automation in general, and drones in particular as a platform for automation, lower the threshold for the use of lethal force, erode distinctions between civilians and combatants, and empower insurgents, terrorists, and drug traffickers who can use this new form of force in radical new ways. And they're true. That's true. They're right. But whatever the differences between supporters and critics of the automation of force and of drones more broadly, both camps' imagination of transformations to come is captured by the theater of war itself, where automation will happen, and the threats and opportunities that radiate and proliferate from it. So in broadest terms, my research, the product of which I'm presenting today here, and which is a collective undertaking, a project called Mapping Actors and Networks in Ukraine, with a research group that's been funded by different funding agencies, but has coalesced more or less around the topic of the war economy in Ukraine over the last 3 years. So my research is concerned with how warfare has transformed Ukraine's state and society and the relationship between the two. Drones are a good example to work here with, but they're also a key part of this transformation that I'm tracing. And so in the rest of this talk, I will try to persuade you, at least in what concerns Ukraine, this prevailing way of thinking about drones and the future they may hold is too narrow. It focuses almost exclusively on the thing itself, on the drone, on how it kills, where it is used, and what risk it poses. This view is basically limited to the battlefield, the military and their supply chains, and it's important to pay attention to it. But using examples from my work in Ukraine, I will argue that this approach is too limited and too narrow in how it understands the origins and development of these technologies, and therefore too limited in how it imagines their social and political consequences. Now, I will not get to this, but you can imagine a further step. Once we understand the origins of these technologies and their use in Ukraine, we might get better at regulating them elsewhere. And I'm very happy to talk about this in the Q&A afterwards. So drones and other technologies that automate coercion and killing do not emerge in a vacuum. They are specific responses to problems that, as in Ukraine, have particular historical roots and are shaped by longer trajectories of social change. These technologies are deeply troubling, and we are right to be concerned about them, and we are right to try to regulate them. But to grasp their full implications globally, we can do worse and start in a particular context, in my case, in Ukraine, And there, we must look beyond the immediate effects on the battlefield of these technologies, even in the context of the military organization. We must examine the political and moral economies that generate the problems that drones try to solve in the first instance. We must try to understand how transformations in the social organization of force are reworking broader political order in Ukraine and elsewhere. And so I'll try to do that now. My starting point is a still minor tradition in my disciplines, in the social sciences, in my disciplines in anthropology and sociology, that writes about war and that it is in agreement with the spirit of Yeats' poem, i.e. it sees the modern world as something transformed by wars. Until recently, war has played a relatively marginal role in the core disciplinary programs in sociology and anthropology. In the history of the place of war in European social thought, from Hobbes to Habermas, quite an extensive one, Hans Joas and Wolfgang Knöbel argue that wars are often constitutive of theory construction, as the informative background to ideas, yet they do not appear in theories themselves, or do so only to a small extent. Writing about this suppression of war, as they call it, Joas and Knöbel do not mean to say that war is absent as a subject or as a metaphor. Rather, they insist that, that despite some exceptions, few thinkers truly made war and violence an integral part of the systemic core of their histories and theories of the state, capitalism, or modernity. Joas and Knöbel argue that even Marxism, which emphasized the violent enforcement of the capitalist mode of production, simply pushed the liberal dream of nonviolent modernity until after the upheavals of the revolution, when Marxists envisaged the rise of social order with no place for violence. So Joas and Knöbel argue that in spite of empirical evidence, wars have been routinely seen as exceptional breakdowns of social order, rather than something that's constitutive of the modern age, as momentous events that change the course of history. They trace a persistent, if uneven, tradition of bellicist social thought into the present. Yet the emphasis on continuity risks obscuring key shifts in the history of ideas. As sociologist Sinesha Malešević notes, classical sociologists, from Hintze to Gumplowitz to Weber and Adams, were deeply engaged with questions of war and violence, placing war at the center of research agendas of fin de siècle sociology. This tradition, however, was largely eclipsed and erased after the Second World War, when Cold War stability, relative stability in Europe and North America led to a selective erasure of organized political violence from the readings of the sociological canon. Malešević, who's himself concerned with the War of Yugoslav succession, argues that it was not until the late 1990s and the early 2000s, with the rising instability of the so-called new wars and renewed US imperialism of forever wars, the sociologists and anthropologists made concerted efforts to integrate the study of war as a generative social force into the mainstream of their discipline. Now, this is not an uncontroversial reading of European sociological tradition, and I acknowledge that. Still, it is hard to disagree that today we are much better placed and much better prepared to understand how specific wars have shaped nearly every aspect of our social existence, and thus we are better placed to integrate the study of wars, both at the core and at the periphery of the world system, into the ways we conceptualize social change in modernity. There are competing accounts of the processes and mechanisms by which mass-scale political violence has transformed political order in modernity. One of the most influential ones focuses on the making of centralized political and administrative institutions. The sociologist Chartilli famously argued that war made the state, and the state made war. The work of Tilly and his followers has examined how modern centralized European states emerged in response to military and fiscal challenges of a violent and competitive geopolitical environment on a politically fragmented European continent. And this argument does not apply necessarily elsewhere, and some of us in this room have studied that. Now, protracted wars and this argument have fostered the development of modern state administration, effective systems of revenue collection, and the mass-scale transportation communication networks. In Europe and North America, perhaps more than anywhere else, specific wars have led to the expansion of citizenship franchise and civil rights and to new forms of welfare provision. They drove capital accumulation and spurred civic associationalism and led to the rise of social movements whose demands changed political cultures and institutions. A series of interstate wars from the late 18th century onwards produced the now dominant form of polity, the nation-state, and helped made modern nationalism a glue of modern mass societies. This growing understanding of the diverse ways in which wars have transformed the world that we inhabit frames how we can think about drones and what they do beyond the battlefield. What fascinates me about drones in Ukraine, and I hope you'll become interested as a result of this, is the way in which their emergence and proliferation on the battlefield since 2014, as well as their transformative political effects beyond the battlefield, have had to do with the emergence of a broad social movement in support of the war effort. And so while ostensibly talking about the transformative effects of drone warfare, I guess what I'm really talking about is the transformative effects of the emergence and consolidation of the social movement of civilian crowdfunders and military activists. The argument will be that the networks, the crowdfunding networks, have become the site not only of military and technological innovation, but also of nation building and state making, of the emergence of new markets, and elaboration of new forms of political participation with lasting consequences for Ukraine's political order, but also further afield. Now, so how did that happen? Ukraine emerged as an independent state in 1991 as one of the most militarized countries in Europe. It inherited a stockpile of Soviet nuclear weapons, around 40% of the Soviet armed forces, and approximately 30% of the Soviet defense industry. In steep economic downfall that saw the country's GDP fall almost 60% between 1990 and 1999, Ukraine could not maintain a military of that size. The country gave up its nuclear weapons, something that many people are still mourning today, and the surviving defense enterprises such as Pivdenmash or Yuzhmash that had once produced intercontinental ballistic missiles deployed to Cuba in 1962, downsized, diversified, and reorientated to new markets. Army personnel was dismissed, military assets were gradually decommissioned, mothballed, or sold to Yugoslavia, Angola, and Liberia by enterprise and defense and secret service officials who had more to gain from predatory asset stripping than from careers disrupted by the disappearance of great power that they had once served. Military expenditure, which declined steadily since 1991, reached its lowest point in 2013. And so really, from this point of view, we can see that the new wars that people like Mary Calder and others have studied, the wars of the post-Cold War order, the civil wars, are just the opposite side of the disintegration of Cold War economies in Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus, and elsewhere, because it was from those places that people like Leonid Minin and Viktor But trafficked arms to places like Liberia, Colombia, and elsewhere. Ukraine's military decline closely mirrored the overall trajectory of the dismantling of state capacity and the privatization of public assets in Ukraine, which fueled profound distrust of the state and its predatory elites. As the Soviet developmental state disintegrated, Ukraine's elites reconstructed the apparatus that they had inherited along rent-seeking and predatory lines. In the context of relative geopolitical stability in the 1990s and the 2000s, they set Ukraine on a reverse path of state formation, as the sociologist Georgy Derlugyan puts it, because there was no need for real armies and armament industries, and no need, therefore, for effective administration, and little need for domestic political bargaining over taxation, personnel, recruitment. This dismantling of the Soviet war economy, the Soviet developmental project, and reduction of the administrative capacity of the Ukrainian state over the first 2 decades of Ukraine's independence ultimately affected the state's ability to respond to the separatist challenge and Russian intervention in Crimea and Donbass in 2014 and after. When Ukraine gained independence, 750,000 soldiers were stationed on Ukraine's territory. By 2014, the Ukrainian armed forces were reduced to about 160,000 military personnel, including less than 120,000 soldiers. According to the Ministry of Defense's own data, in 2014, only 4% of them had life-saving items like helmets and bulletproof jackets. So this dismantling of military capacity in turn set the stage for the drama of volunteer mobilization to the front line and for the ways that volunteer fighters and military activists helping them would seek to procure small consumer drones for Donbass front lines and afterwards for the full-scale invasion as well. In April 2014, the post-revolution government in Kyiv deployed regular forces and militias to the anti-terror operation in the eastern Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk to counter the separatist threat. Pro-Maidan activists, many of whom had just stood down after months of protests, mobilized their connections and their social media followers to make up for deficient military logistics with crowd-funded food and technical gear, as well as drones, vehicles, ammunition, and sometimes even light weapons. military activists emerged as key mediators between frontline units and their donor supporters and civilians in the rear. Thus, a social movement was born, whose members, in the subsequent years of the war, would go on to provide military and humanitarian aid, organized commercial production of weapons, including drones, and take up government offices, participating in the state-led project of regulating the war economy, both from below and from above. Now, here I enter the picture. In November 2021, against the backdrop of Russia's amassed forces on Ukraine's border, I began to interview veterans of the regular military, as well as militias, former revolutionaries, officials, and military crowdfunding volunteers in Kyiv. I was interested in how new elites were emerging out of the fires of war and revolution. And the volunteers I spoke with joked that I had come 5 years too late. After 2015, with protracted economic crisis and incorporations of militias into the regular forces, the crowdfunding volunteer movement had subsided. At the same time, Ukraine's state military spending increased by 72% between early 2014 and 2021, reaching almost $6 billion, or 3.2% of the GDP. In this process, just on the eve of the full-scale invasion. In this process, the once dynamic field of crowdfunding activism became split between several oligopolists, volunteer networks that had managed to professionalize and specialize their activities, while many of the small networks that had been active kind of died down. So one of these larger crowdfunding organizations is called Come Back Alive. You might have heard about it. And it allowed me to conduct participant observation in their cramped offices in downtown Kyiv in late 2021, after I passed their obligatory lie detector test that found that I was a bit of a liar, but not much of a spy. Interviews with their employees and their allies from other crowdfunding networks painted a picture of the war in Donbass in 2014-2021 that was somewhat disturbing and that put informal cooperation squarely at the center of the organizational warfare, with lasting consequences. Both militias and regular units, the people told me, relied on an informal economy of crowdfunded supplies. This, in turn, spawned more informality. Pickup trucks and SUVs supplied to the frontline units by crowdfunders, and often actually smuggled into Ukraine with support of the border guards, were mostly kept off the books of these units to allow for more flexible deployment, or because of the limitations of what property the units could take on, or because of commanders' attempts to avoid formal responsibility for the vehicle's eventual destruction. That would certainly be the case had they took these assets on balance of their military units. This in turn made it impossible, for example, to officially procure fuel for this vehicle. And some vehicles anyway ran on petrol. And this actually happened because there was just not enough supply of armored personnel carriers or other vehicles in Ukraine. And so some vehicles anyway ran on petrol, while the military often could only provide diesel. Unit commanders, therefore, had to write off diesel as used by one officially registered by dysfunctional vehicle in order to use it for these crowdfunded vehicles instead. Or they had to sell off such formally written off fuel on the black market and use the revenue to buy petrol for the crowdfunded vehicles that could actually run. Money raised from these informal fuel sales was also used to pay for supplies of building materials and electricity cables to equip fortifications during units' deployments to the front line, and these costs could be in turn returned on rotation when a new unit would take up the position, paying up part of the previous unit's infrastructural sunken costs. Drones were part and parcel of this informal economy. Many of those I spoke to at the time in 2021 considered the provision of small consumer drones to the front line one of the most important and prestigious form of informal military aid in 2014, 2017, 2018. Now, at the beginning of the war in Donbass, consumer drone technology was just becoming accessible and good enough to enable the troops to use the small Chinese-made drones, usually DJI Phantoms, I think, to use these drones for frontline reconnaissance and surveillance. These drones were rarely procured officially and were often, like the SUVs, kept off the books by their recipients in the military. Russian interventions at Ilovaisk in August 2014 and Debaltseve in January, February 2015 forced an unfavorable peace agreement, the Minsk Peace Accords 1 and 2, onto Ukraine, leading to regular and failed efforts at armistice. Under the terms of this peace agreement, Ukrainian infantry were left without the cover of heavy artillery and were regularly prohibited from engaging the enemy. And actually, this is one of the sources of the lasting political dissatisfaction of many of the military volunteers and crowdfunding volunteers of the time with the government of the time. And so these units were often regularly actually prohibited from engaging the enemy, even if they were attacked. Frustrated, some of them began to modify the civilian drones that they had received with remotely controlled drop mechanisms, which were 3D printed or manufactured by hand, that allowed a small munition, usually a grenade, to be dropped on enemy targets. As informal gifts to the military, the drones existed entirely out of the military bureaucracy and thus outside of military control and accountability. Combined with off-the-books trophy grenades, they became weapons that could be used without an official permission to engage, maintaining plausible deniability that did not disturb paper peace. Now, this was a small-scale practice, really, and it's something that existed in a couple of units that later on spread the know-how more broadly. But in this way, the militarized consumer drone, the prototype of today's proliferating battlefield technology, emerged on the ruins of the Soviet war economy, out of the efforts of a bottom-up social movement to shore up state sovereignty that was being challenged by Russian-backed separatists. And so it came out of the political conflict that had fostered in Ukraine with the revolution and the attempts to counter it with the anti-Maidan and then Russian intervention. Now, how did these drones become ubiquitous on the front lines? As I said, Ukrainian volunteer movement had subsided after 2015. Although many volunteers may have seen themselves as working in opposition to an absent, dysfunctional state, the state that had not held much legitimacy for them, some cultivated ties with state institutions, joint executive bodies, or were elected into local authorities or national parliament, without lasting consequences, actually. This cooperation that had characterized the early years of the war in Donbass institutionalized a new genre of relating to fellow citizens in need as well. It introduced thousands of people to organizational repertoires of bottom-up organizing for the public goods and popularized an understanding of self-reliant active citizenship among the middle class in Ukraine. It also created densely interconnected civic networks that linked veterans groups with political parties, Western-funded NGOs and state institutions, and broader political movements. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 galvanized these networks and radically expanded the circle of people and organizations involved in volunteerism. It pushed many peer groups, workplace networks, and political organizations previously uninvolved in volunteer work to reorient towards it. And my favorite example is actually a BDSM club in Kyiv that started to fundraise for the war effort. And it led local officials and public employees like teachers and museum workers to start using their premises and connections to raise and deliver aid for the front line. In the meantime, the size of the defense forces tripled to over 1 million, and the front line was extended, and the fighting intensified, and more than 10 million people were displaced in the immediate aftermath of the invasion, domestically or internationally. As a result, more people and organizations than ever before were in need of and became involved in aid networks, while the number, density, and size of these networks also increased, and more money and supplies than ever before flowed through them. In 2022 and 2023, Ukraine's 3 largest military crowdfunding organizations, the state-run United 24 and 2 independent groups, Come Back Alive and Serhiy Prytula Foundation, raised over 53 billion hryvnias, or about $1.7 billion in monetary donations. That's just 3 organizations. Thousands of smaller organizations, for which there are no centralized statistics, likely channeled as much or more, not counting the worth of donated goods and free labor. Now, my project has tried to track about 150 crowdfunding organizations and individual aid brokers and the networks that they sustained in the first 2 years of the war. And we counted somewhat less, but we estimated that about $8 billion flowed in the first 2 years of the war through those 150 networks outside of the 3 largest charities, right? So large sums. But these sums were still a drop in the widening ocean of Ukraine's war needs. The invasion was a profound economic shock to the Ukrainian government, making it increasingly dependent, economically and politically, on Western aid, and forcing it to intensify efforts to mobilize domestic revenues in order to make up for the shortages and irregularity of Western aid, grants, and loans. By the end of 2023, Ukraine's GDP was about 30% lower than it had been before the invasion, while the government was spending 11 times more on defense than in 2021, the equivalent of about 38% of the GDP. In this context, and $6 to $8 billion if you're interested. In this context, state expenditure increased by 80%, so general state expenditure, not just defense, increased by 80% between 2021 and 2023, which dramatically expanded the state's influence on the national economy. As a result, the Ukrainian economy could not generate enough funds to cover the state expenditures. In fact, defense spending absorbed the entirety of domestic revenues generated by the state, even though the state began to generate more and more, actually generated more in taxes than ever before in 2024. Of the $106 billion of central state expenditure in 2023, over 61% was covered externally through grants, loans, and bonds from Ukraine's mostly Western allies. Foreign aid, therefore, freed up domestic revenues to be spent on defense, creating a fragile balance that could be upset by any variation in aid flows, because what the Ukraine did not spend of its own resources on the war, on the civilian spending, because it could use humanitarian aid and grants and loans, it was spending on purchasing weapons. In the first half of 2024, both donor funding and military assistance to Ukraine from the United States and the EU were delayed, having become ensnared in internal political conflicts in these polities. This led to an unintended political consequence within Ukraine, which shaped the way that drones were adopted and used. Early on, in the full-scale invasion, Ukraine requested and adopted artillery of a new caliber, 155 millimeters, which are standard in NATO countries, but not in Ukraine, and differ from those Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union. Thus, Ukraine became dependent on shell supplies from the United States and its allies, which have struggled in the intervening period to meet Ukraine's demand without depleting their own stockpiles. Anthropologist Daryl Lee argues that the shell shortage in the United States and more broadly in this kind of among Ukraine's supporters reflects the US and US-led world's priorities over the past quarter century of unipolar hegemony, namely a focus on making precision-guided missiles more suited for aerial manhunting in places such as Afghanistan and Iraq than to fighting a conventional war at the intensity that Ukraine was fighting it. Ukraine's war economy therefore became integrated into the war economy of a transnational empire that had over the previous 3 decades become reorganized around fighting small wars on its imperial peripheries. The allies have thus struggled to meet Ukraine's demand without depleting their own stockpiles, particularly as part of the shells initially earmarked in Ukraine was instead used by Israel to shell Gaza after October 2024. 23. Time flies, and actually with wars you can't reckon time. Dependence on foreign supplies from a war economy not geared to the kind of war Ukraine is fighting has had dire consequences for Ukraine's forces, which have been significantly outgunned, leading to increased losses of lives and territory and resulting in political tensions in the government. Shortages of artillery, in turn, of all calibers, pushed the Ukrainian military to start to adapt small drones provided by crowdfunders into guided kamikaze weapons with improvised munitions attached to them. And throughout 2023, an increasing number of crowdfunding campaigns reorientated to the provision of the so-called first-person view, or FPV drone, which is a hobbyist racing drone, and new drone assembly workshops spawned to meet crowdfunders and unit demands on the front line, also actually leading to a new form of injury among the soldiers, combatants who were trying to modify hand grenades or pieces of unexploded ordnance into these improvised munitions to be attached to the FPV drones. As the Ukrainian military struggled to mobilize troops to replace the losses, some frontline brigades also began to use FPV drones as a way of plugging the holes on the front line, trying to stop Russian infantry and mechanized assaults far from forward trenches of Ukrainian troops, in which, in some cases, 2 out of 3 soldiers that were meant to be there were missing because of troop shortages. In this context, the Ukrainian government has begun to lean on the foundations prepared by the crowdfunders. By the end of 2023, the government, building on the success of United 24, that some of you have contributed to those successes, the government began to direct about $1 billion of funds taken from local authorities' budgets to a centralized program of drone procurements, which mostly began to buy from local producers. This decision dramatically expanded centralized demand for domestically produced drones over the course of 2024 and led to an expansion of the capacity of production from about 1 million FPV drones in 2024 to what Zelensky now said, between 4 and 6 million drones. The capacity is not met because there's just not enough funding, but still it's there. And this in turn cemented the military's reliance on weaponized drones to mitigate shortages of munitions and shortages of troops. So drone became a kind of a fix, right? State spending on drone procurement has grown ever since, with Western allies contributing hundreds of millions of euros and pounds in the British case, towards producing drones in Ukraine and towards starting co-producing initiatives both in Ukraine and abroad. And in so doing, the Ukrainian government has de facto created a new market for kamikaze drones in Ukraine, a market, or expanded the new market, a market that is rapidly assuming an international dimension. So I want to emphasize here that this could only have happened because of drone crowdfunding networks, because drones had not only provided funding for purchases of drones from Ukraine or from abroad and for orders from domestic producers. These networks had created a bottom-up ecosystem for military innovation. Crowdfunders have been involved in training of drone operators and pilots, without which you can't use the drones that they provide. They have provided direct funding to domestic drone producers, facilitating their entry into the market and reducing the financial pressures on startups, thereby kind of fostering the emergence of these startups. Some producers have also set up their own charitable foundations to cut out the middlemen among the crowdfunders. These crowdfunders have also mediated between drone producers and frontline recipients, channeling product feedback from the frontline to the producers, in turn kind of making it easier to innovate. In all these ways, this bottom-up movement has shaped both supply and demand for drones, much before the state built on it to catalyze the emerging market. Now, Western drone producers, interestingly, have been eager to tap into this, to the possibilities opened up by the innovation ecosystem that was established by the crowdfunders. Some have retained Ukrainian activists to broker the provision of their products to the front line, often free provision, in return for feedback. And one active crowdfunder in Ukraine says that even though he doesn't receive any support from the government, a household name among American billionaires cuts a check to him, and this man just happens to support a German-based company into which Peter Thiel had invested. We can talk about that later if you want. But this has allowed these Western companies like Anduril and Quantum Systems to adjust and refine their products in real time and claim that these products have been battle-tested in Ukraine, which then helps them secure lucrative contracts with Western militaries. And it's there that the real value lies. But in Ukraine, the military crowdfunders have basically enabled the extraction of value out of the Ukraine's drone ecosystem in the form of free data and unpaid R&D that's done by drone users on the front line. Now, to summarize the story so far, small drones were first militarized in Ukraine in response to the challenges emerging out of the dismantling of the old Soviet war economy and the reconfiguration of the world order following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. The Russian invasion has catalyzed this process by making Ukraine dependent on an alliance of powers whose war economies, by choice or by design, could not meet Ukraine's frontline needs. And Ukraine could not do it itself. Crowdfunders have sought once again to, in this case, to provide a situational fix to the problems of dependency and short supplies. And this contingent process has resulted in a saturation of the front line with small drones, which set the background for current discussion about drones as the future of war. So this brings me to the final and perhaps most important part of the talk, because having traced the origins of Ukraine's drone warfare in a bottom-up social movement and the political orders that this movement tried to navigate and bridged, I now want to reverse the perspective and consider political effects of crowdfunders' involvement in drone supplies. And I'll speak mostly about Ukraine, but I hope that it will be evident how that can function as a model for what we ought to pay attention to elsewhere. The crowdfunding movement has effectively grown since 2022 into a people's economy of war. The concept of war economy draws attention to how political economies are organized to provide and pay for war. Arguing that the US should organize a war economy to respond to the challenges introduced by the 9/11 attacks, James Galbraith wrote at the time that in war economy, the public obligation is to do what is necessary, to support the military effort, to protect and defend the home territory, and especially to maintain the physical well-being, solidarity, and morale of the people. Galbraith's articulation of the imperial raison d'etat at the time reveals the general role of morality in the construction of war economies. Moral considerations inform how political obligations and the public good are understood, how images of war as just or unjust are constructed, how violence is construed and limited, for example, through international humanitarian law, and how circumstances of legitimate killing and categories of people who can be killed or should be protected are designated. Crucially, more economies also shape who is seen as a legitimate actor in the conduct and organization of war, who can act, fund, and speak on behalf of the collective effort, establishing in this process a hierarchy of civic legitimacy that determines inclusion in or exclusion from wartime publics and the wartime nation as well. Now, this is at the heart of the kinds of social change that the people's economy of war, and the drone warfare in particular, have propelled in Ukraine. The widely noted centrality of drones in Ukraine's war theater has elevated the status of actors that were involved in drone supplies, making them more connected to more powerful others, and therefore also more powerful themselves than those who are providing food or tactical gear. These other non-drone forms of supply are predominantly crowdfunded. Unlike these other forms of supply, such as tactical gear, food, or vehicles, drones, because of their cost, are predominantly crowdfunded online, and thereby crowdfunders have to rely on their ability to mobilize digital publics of strangers en masse. And this has lent drone fundraising and warfare an added visibility within an expanded ecosystem of civic and military activists, because basically drone crowdfunders have to constantly maintain publicity that will generate a stream of revenue that makes this war economy, that gives to this war economy a really interesting mediatized public dimension, and that shifts some of the political struggles that you would see elsewhere in other war economies among patrons and clients into this domain of digital publics. Now, this transformation and this effect stems from a basic feature of drone use in Ukraine. Drones are a consumable, something that is constantly destroyed or lost in battle. As a result, their cumulative cost, although each drone is not very expensive, between $400 and $2,000, the cumulative cost and the need for supporting infrastructure for the use of drones make their steady supply financially and logistically quite burdensome and expensive, particularly for small crowdfunders and under-resourced military units. These pressures have driven drone-focused crowdfunding brokers to build alliances with businesses, logistic providers, producers, and the state, in which each of these parties brought distinct resources and tried to benefit from. As colleagues in our broader research projects have shown, crowdfunding actors specialized in drones in Ukraine are on average more central and more broadly networked than those dealing with other aid forms in the overall networks of the crowdfunding economy of the war in Ukraine. And this gives them a distinct advantage. Over the course of the war, this has propelled several Ukrainian crowdfunders, military commanders, low-level military commanders, and state officials involved in the drone economy into positions of public prominence. Some have joined corporate boards or state advisory councils. Others have had close allies from within the crowdfunding organizations promoted to lead war-related government offices. In one recent case, a kind of a military activist from inside the military has become the commander of the unmanned systems force at the highest level. While this elite formation is not exclusive to drone provision, Syria's involvement in drone supplies in Ukraine and the publicity this entails confirms a form of network privilege onto those involved, which shapes their influence and visibility across the war effort. So the war economy has produced new civic and political elites, or has begun to produce new forms of civic and political elites in Ukraine by giving legitimacy to new kinds of actors, the aid broker. But it has also changed how the political system, or potentially changed, and here is where my arguments enter shakier grounds, but let's try. It also changed how the political system in Ukraine works overall. Local and national politicians seem to have understood this very quickly. In 2023, as the war became protracted, leaders of multiple municipalities across Ukraine, from Lviv to Zhytomyr to Odessa, have began directing portions of city budgets towards drone procurement for the front line, often for units connected to the cities, while mimicking the visual and rhetorical genres of civic crowdfunding to frame their actions as grassroots given and therefore as legitimately coming from this bottom-up mobilization. This convergence of public fundraising and political branding must be understood within the structure of Ukraine's patronal political system, in which access to power has traditionally hinged on loyalty, personal ties, and reciprocal obligations between hierarchical networks rooted in the state, local administrations, and financial industrial groups, the oligarchs. Since the full-scale invasion, martial law and the indefinite suspension of elections have disrupted elite circulation and frozen peacetime office holders in place, and they actually have disrupted the normal dynamics of the patronal political system. In this altered context, participation in crowdfunding and its state-backed analogues has emerged as a kind of a critical new channel for political visibility and legitimacy, not just for civilian crowdfunders, but also for power brokers and politicians. Donations to drone procurement, therefore, and also to other forms of crowdfunding, signal loyalty to the national cause at a time when open political competition is delegitimized and loyalty has become the currency of political relevance. And also where there's literally no other ways of signaling your political relevance because political competition and most forms of political process have been frozen. Local officials use these practices to consolidate their standing in a political field where elections are no longer the main test of their strength as potential patrons. For local elites, joint participation in crowdfunding can also function as a way of making and maintaining relationships with each other and with state actors. Participation in aid brokering thus functions as a form of elite reproduction, a way in which social ties are made and renewed, opportunities are created, and social recognitions and esteem are sourced, and new elites are created. In the absence of democratic contestation, actors across this public-private spectrum have turned to the war economy as a platform for political signaling and the consolidation of symbolic capital. Across the board, participation in this emergent people's economy of war has become a key locus of political change in Ukraine. And this has implications not only for the ongoing war effort, but also for national and local political economies across Ukraine. The emergence of the crowdfunding economy since 2022, February 2022, has contributed to the transformation of Ukraine's regime dynamics, patterns of patronage, forms of political participation, and understandings of what it means to be a good citizen and a legitimate political actor. Now, a qualification. The provision and production of drones has not been the only driver of this process, but it has been a particularly potent one, exemplifying the ways in which the emerging economy of drone warfare in Ukraine, mediated by the social movement of crowdfunders, is reshaping political orders far from the front line. Now, to conclude, I began this talk with a far-fetched, perhaps, poetic reference to another time and place, to consequences of other wars. And so, like others who have stolen from Yeats' Second Coming, I too have drawn on the poem for the ways, maybe indirectly, for the ways that it can help us frame our attention to transformative effects of wars. When things fall apart, if you follow Yeats, we ought to look not only to the blood-dimmed tide of war itself, but to what this tide breaks on, what it erodes and transforms, and to the silt and debris that it deposits. In Ukraine, I have argued, small militarized drones were first used on the battlefield, perhaps less out of efforts to bring about a new future of war, than as a way to respond to lingering legacies and ruins of an economy of the long-ended Cold War. After Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the use of these drones was then scaled up as a response to Ukraine's integration on dependent, subordinate terms into another legacy economy of past wars, of US post-Cold War imperial dominance. The proliferating drones profoundly changed military tactics and thus the social order of the battlefield on both sides of the war and set the terms for the debate about the future of war. But in this process, I've tried to argue, at least in Ukraine, something perhaps even more important happened than the rise of this new technology. A social movement emerged that has become a new terrain on which Ukrainian political orders are rethought and reworked, and through which Ukrainian battlefields have become plugged into emergent circuits of global militarized capitalism. Even if the war were to end now, this transformation will leave a lasting consequence on the shape of the actors, networks, and ideas that it has propelled to prominence. The social movement that has emerged around the provision of drones and other military supplies is perhaps the biggest novelty and lesson from the war in Ukraine. And this is because, I think, when we think about the future of war and risk that it holds for all of us, we might do well to pay attention not only to the new ways that technology and force are used on the battlefield and beyond, but also to how wars reshaped the very social and political fabrics that sustain them, how new forms of collective action, legitimacy, and belonging emerged alongside and through conflict. In Ukraine, the drone movement reveals that war is not only a site of destruction and violence, but also a crucible of state and nation-making, where old orders are unsettled and new political logics are forged. Understanding these transformations is crucial if you are to grasp the full impact of contemporary warfare, not simply as technological innovation or military strategy or reorganization of militaries, but as a profound force that reconfigures societies and their futures. Now, to quote once more from Yeats' poem, let us hope then that as the wars and genocides are raging on across the world, no rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There are a whole series of implications emerging from your research and your observations. I would like to start with a slightly complicated question. If we look at Yugoslavia and the civil wars in Yugoslavia, behind the nationalist rhetoric, there was a process of privatization in which state assets were grabbed by relatively small elites made up of former party people, intelligence agencies, and organized crime. Ukraine is a very different example, it seems to me, and you're describing the difference by introducing crowdfunding and drone technology itself. The implication, although you didn't explicitly say this, was of a democratization or a decentralization of weapons procurement and logistics. But what we've seen in Ukraine is it started with people importing, your crowdfunding groups, and I've met some of them, going around in their vans and their trucks, delivering drones and computers and other technologies to frontline units. It started off with importation, but since then we have seen the emergence of a significant drone industry in Ukraine. And my question relates to this. Who owns those drone industries? Are the crowdfunders being cut out from that? And are you seeing an older elite using the emergence of that part of the war economy, a centralized production of drones and its distribution, to reassert their influence? Or are you seeing a new elite who are engaged with that drone production and distribution on a much more centralized way than in a much more centralized fashion than the way it began? I hope that makes sense.
It makes absolute sense. Thanks, Misha, for that, and perhaps make you clarify part of the argument. Ukraine is an interesting case for the construction of war economies because, actually similar to Britain in the 18th century and early 19th century, it has relied on a form of a public-private partnership de facto, right? I mean, the state acts as, by now, as an ultimate buyer of the provisions, but it relies on network of logistical suppliers and intermediaries, private producers, in this particular case drone producers, to fill in the need, right? So the state has not taken over some of the new forms of military procurement and production. The state has a role to play in the old armaments industries and has been trying to kind of involve private investment into those, but that doesn't concern me today. But it's important that there is this effort to, on the part of the state and in conjunction with crowdfunders, to foster the emergence of a new market and to rely on that market. Now, in that market, lots of different things happen. So you see the emergence of old petty traders, suddenly, with local, somewhat corrupt connections at the level of municipality or the region, going en masse into the procurement of drones. I did this thing for a study for the UK Foreign Office, where we looked at the public procurement documents for all across but local authorities all across Ukraine. And the municipality of Dnipro in central Ukraine emerged as one of the largest spenders on the procurement of drones. And if you looked at how many providers they spent the almost billion UN hryvnias on, well, there were 2. And both of them had connections to the municipality. Now, that's completely different elsewhere across Ukraine, where other regions have favored multiple procurers and providers and have allowed as it were, the profits of that economy to trickle down. And so the process is contradictory. In some places, because of who will manage to get where, you see the old elites resurfacing with this. In other places, you see new elites emerging. But what interests me is that some of the crowdfunders and some of the old elites have really managed to form a kind of a pact by interest, where crowdfunders understood that the thing of the moment is to begin investing in production, have provided investment or funding, the investment funding for some of these new emerging producers, while people who, for example, in Odessa owned part of the private port infrastructure used the advantages of the logistics business to set up the production of drones with the help of what the crowdfunders had to offer. But those were, established elites, but often quite young, agile, with connections in the IT sectors and across the civic sector, who had benefited maybe from years of campaigning and activism and philanthropy before. So you see those old connections among them emerging. And what you don't see is the old oligarchy investing in, also participating in the drone economy en masse.
That's very interesting indeed. On the drones themselves, the technological developments have been so rapid that we almost can't keep up with what's happening. There is a certain school of thought which believes that within a short space of time, drones themselves will be obsolete because the countermeasures that are coming, particularly laser technology, are going to be so effective against drone technology. Do you see crowdfunders, Ukrainian armed forces, the Ukrainian state anticipating what is happening technologically? And because really they stole a march on the Russians in a fantastically impressive way by their use of drone technology in the first place. And the Russians have been playing catch up with Ukraine. So does Ukraine hold an advantage over Russia in terms of its understanding of technological development on the battlefield?
It's hard to say. I mean, really, I told you just one half of the story. The other half of the story is what's happening on the opposite side of the battlefield and with the Russian war economy. And this is a constant process of competition and adaptation, where local innovations are spread partly through these networks, sometimes scaled up successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully. And this is also the process by which these innovations spread further afield. So yes, even if, for example, this Wunderwaffe of the laser, the British laser, will go and laser through the world, and there will be forces that will not have it, and that there will be situational advantage that will be conferred by all kinds of drones. This is exactly what happened in Ukraine's attempts to advance in the Kursk Oblast a year ago into Russia, because they managed to surprise Russians with somewhat different drone that operated on somewhat different frequencies and therefore couldn't be jammed. But the drone itself was not of any particular cutting edge form, right? And so you see today, even though I'm sure that the Turkish state anticipates the challenges of drones, you still see today in the news the optic fiber drones, FPV drones used against them by the Kurdish forces, right? So this is a kind of a constant process of going back and forth of adaptation and innovation. And what I did not talk about was how that innovation has been scaled up and how the advantages have been solidified. And this is partly because I don't know yet. I mean, this is a part of my project that I'm working on. We're trying to compare the ways in which Russia and Ukraine have built up their industrial policies to procure for drones. But there, for example, even though Ukrainians have often been, at least the conventional wisdom has it, that Ukrainians have often been fast at innovating, the Russians have been better at scaling up, because they could put the might of the oil revenues and so on and so forth into mass production of these small drones.
Terrific. Questions from the floor. I'm going to start here in the front and I'm going to go round.
Thank you so much for your talk. I actually remember in the earlier stages of the war donating for a drone, which was like a colleague's second cousin or something. So it's really interesting to see this contextualized and as part of the kind of broader political economy you're talking about. My question is similar to Misha's first one, which was about this interesting implication of democratization or decentralization. And it's slightly different in that this question of legitimacy you raised, this idea that because it's democratized, it must be good. It's not quite the same as this liberal democracy, which obviously sets limits. You know, it's this direct democracy, and for me, it does raise these questions of accountability and oversight. And I am wondering if that was a consideration amongst the elites you're talking about. If they're developing a market, are they also developing any form of checks on it, or this kind of self-reflective, responsibility, or is it the sense that this is an absolute situation? It requires an absolute kind of democratization without any conception of limits on activity. Thank you.
Thanks. Shall we take it one by one? Thanks for highlighting actually the ways in which we all participate in the drone economy, whether in those ways of directly donating or consuming the products produced with Russian oil, right? I did not want to say that democratized means good. Yes, some people might want to make that argument. Democratization in Ukraine is good because, or can be seen as kind of actually a good thing in this particular context, because the flows of funding to the front line are not centralized outside of the state, right? No one actor has been able to capture them, and so no one could establish some form of patronage, for example, and they would, for example, dictating what the military forces should do on the front line by holding or withholding funding. So plurality is in principle good, yet it has to be controlled. I'm not privy to discussions inside the Ukrainian government. I believe in their qualified competence that they would try to control some of the proliferations and aspects of this. I know that it is happening with conventional weapons. However, you cannot but help noticing that the way in which this drone economy has been built up has been basically based on almost like libertarian ideals of the people who had been running it, primarily Vice Prime Minister Taras Fedirko, who had come from the IT sector. And recently commenting to The Guardian, he said that, oh yeah, automation's all great. I mean, this is for us, it's a question of survival. We will think about regulation after the war. And that is a problem. It's a problem because in the meantime, yes, it does help foster innovation and kind of speeds it up. In this context, there is some form of regulatory force, and that is often the idea of the public good that these people subscribe to. But my big question is, and I don't know an answer to it, is for how long will that hold? What are the conditions under which Ukrainians' nationalism and their patriotism, their subscription to this idea of the public good and the contribution to the war economy will act as a regulatory force, stopping the proliferation of these technologies and the skills far away from the front line. Every time I see a public gathering, every time I go to a wedding now, and I hear a drone above, I search for cover. Because I cannot but be aware of the fact that is a risk. Sorry, I didn't answer your question, but I talked.
Next question there. Sorry, can you introduce yourself as well?
Sorry, retrospectively, my name is Helen. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Cambridge. I've escaped to Vienna for the summer.
Hey, I'm Matthew Benson. I'm with the London School of Economics. So my question, I'm more of an economic historian of Sudan and South Sudan, of course, where a lot of drones and these sort of things are also taking place. But this phenomenon you described of this fiscal fragmentation is one that has led to a great deal of predation in Sudan. And so I'm curious to see, again, sort of echoing your question, but I mean, what are the possibilities to imagine how this could actually lead to a state that is more inclusive, or is it just going to become co-opted in some way down the line? And I'd really like to see some sort of comparison with other states. I mean, Sudan seems like a very vivid example precisely because there are sort of lots of just very similar patterns taking shape. So yeah, thank you very much.
Well, thanks for raising that. South Sudan is an interesting example because this project emerged out of me learning from a project held at Small Arms Survey called MAPS, Mapping Actors and Networks in South Sudan, that tried to understand the transformation of the political economy of the war in South Sudan. Now, there could be like a classic boring argument, you know, the Tillian argument about the way in which if the Ukrainian state manages to return on what it has asked of its citizens to, expand the welfare and civic rights afterwards, and to consolidate the state capacity that has built up, it might, after the end of the war, or in the case of a protracted war, retain the state capacity that's built up and use it for the public good. Now, Ukraine, I recently argued in a piece I've published with Volodymyr Artyukh, is, however, because of its dependence on Western allies, fiscal dependence on Western allies, is undergoing a kind of a process of dependent state formation. So on the one hand, you see this sort of state acting together with crowdfunders and the bottom-up mobilization of civic activists and others, acting together to expand state capacity. Expand states' capacity to mobilize resources and people to the front line. So the military and political power of the state is increased, its legitimacy is increased. On the other hand, economically, it's become much more dependent on Western support, and that has made political decisions about the conduct of the war in Ukraine, including about the conduct of mobilization, which is a very sensitive issue. It has connected them to political dynamics elsewhere, in Washington or in Brussels or in London. And we've seen that very well now with the negotiations of Ukraine's resource sovereignty with Trump, right? And that is a contradictory dynamic. So on the one hand, the states become, yes, more legitimate, more powerful. On the other hand, this power has been undercut by this new dependence. And it's hard to say which way it's going to go. And it depends really on how and on what term, how fast and on what terms the war will end, and whether or not Ukraine will retain some of its independent industrial capacity to generate fiscal revenues for the state, whether or not enough of the working population will remain in Ukraine, whether Ukrainians will be able to work in the Ukrainian economy, whether Ukraine will have to rely on controlled foreign laborers that will be shipped from elsewhere. So a lot of that is still in play, and therefore I can't answer whether or not it will go down the Sudan or South Sudan way of fiscal fragmentation, or will go down the European route of state formation, of kind of consolidation of central administrative power. I hope it will go down the European route, but the future is open, I think.
We've got a question in the front row here.
Right. Thanks, Taras. I'm going to give you three lines, and you can choose to follow one of them or none of them at all. And then I have to go make some phone calls, so forgive me if I just disappear right after. So poetry, capitalism, and democracy. The thing about the Yeats business at the beginning, and I say this as one of the large group of people who has cited that poem during this war, is that it seems to me that we're actually in a world where the center did hold in large measure because of the drones. Like not everybody's world, right? Like not the world of Gaza, not the world of South Sudan, but the world looked at outward from Kiev or even from Europe, or maybe even something like the West, did hold in large measure because of Ukrainian civil society, among other things, its ability to raise money for drones, right? So in a world in which Russia does win the war in 2022, right, which is a different world, but in that world, the center doesn't hold, right? You wouldn't be having this lecture. This institute probably doesn't exist. Many, many things would be different, right? Oh, that's the shocking thing, the institute not existing? Okay. I mean, many other worse things would have happened, my friends, besides that. And so I wanted, so when you tease us, you know, with the hawk and the hand, I can't help but think that that in fact, actually you're telling a story of the center holding in an unexpected way, and the way that it holds is by not being the center, which leads me, so I'll do next the point about democracy, and this speaks to other questions. The Tilly argument, insofar as I remember it, and as you cite it, is that the challenge of warfare leads to centralization. But that's not what you're describing, right? That's not what you're describing. What you're describing is something else, which is that I think it's something much more like the challenge of keeping your fellow human beings alive leads to certain kinds of small-scale innovations or cooperation, right? So, I mean, the Ukrainian state has become more functional in the last few years, but I think it's your argument that that functionality is a result of lots of small-scale activity, and that the war, you can't say that the war itself is the unmediated cause of that. One can imagine the Ukrainian state of 10 years ago, or 15 years ago, just collapsing, right? And so it seems to me that Tilly's in the background of all this, and you refer to him a couple of times, but it seems that it matters a lot what kind of society is there when the war begins. Because in a way, it seems like one way to understand your argument would be the war was mediated by a pre-existing civil society which was already impressively horizontally networked, and therefore was a natural fit with this kind of organization. But if you don't have the prior moments of civic engagement in Ukraine, then you can't get to the drone story. Right, and so it's a matter of, it's a matter of what kind of society the war hits, and that category of civil society is just not there in Tilly, right? Unless I'm remembering this very wrong, which leads me to capitalism. So you're definitely right about Minister Fedorov and like the libertarianism and all this. That's certainly true, and you refer to capitalism a few times in the talk, like capitalism is like this phantom which is waiting to break through into the talk. Like we don't actually see it; it's not really there, but it's about to break through. And I just want to make the point as someone who's observed these networks at various of their nexi, that whatever this is, like it ain't capitalism, right? It's not a few people making a lot of money. It's a product which blows up, right? Like its main purpose is to keep people alive, which is, par excellence, not the purpose of capitalism, to keep people alive. And so it's done by like this network which involves multiple states, multiple municipalities, various kinds of armed force groups. And so it doesn't really look like capitalism, right? It seems to me that the danger you're pointing to is that, I think you're exactly right, is that the American companies will then extract something from all of this. But I think it's not in itself capitalism. I think it's something else. And so I think there's a temptation there's a sort of the reason why I say poetry, democracy, and capitalism is that there's a tension in your talk where like the dark forces of the poem are pulling in certain directions. But then there's actually a sense in which your argument is pushing in completely different directions. And I'm not sure which way you actually want to realize this. And I would appeal maybe a little bit to the anthropologist in you over the sociologist, because the sociologist gives us the kind of neutral terms of capitalism, nation building, and state building. But I don't think your argument, the stories you're telling really work without the more human categories of life, right? The attempt to preserve life, empathy, and like in the sense of human agency and participation. So those slightly softer terms, I think, are necessary inside your harder argument.
Absolutely, and thanks for bringing this up, because this is the talk that I didn't give, and it's the talk that I've written and given elsewhere, which is about the kind of the implication of the ideas of value and the value of worth of life in this war economy. I'll deal with capitalism and Tilly and democracy, and we'll leave poetry to the poets. You're absolutely right about this tension. This is not in itself capitalism, right? And I disagree with those who, writing for the Jacobin, for example, have tried to say, oh, this is just a neoliberal war economy. Well, it has some forms of organization like that. If you look at more effective crowdfunders, they use the newest managerial software and they use spreadsheets and they organize in these ways. But that is not in itself about accumulation and capture of extraction of value, right? it can give rise to capitalism, and that would be the moment of like a primitive accumulation of a grab of value and extraction of it. And I see that, and you're exactly right, in the ways in which some of these Western companies have spread their tentacles to Ukraine and are trying to help, but also take as they do that. In Ukraine, well, I think we'll wait and see. I hope that it will give rise to a more socially minded, or at least, well, I guess socially, politically minded form of business, where profiting goes hand in hand with delivery of a public good of national defense. But this said, my talk wouldn't have a subject had the Ukrainian state not allowed these companies, unlike other arms producers, to keep 25% of their revenue as profit. And to reinvest that, partly to reinvest it, but also to keep that as a profit. So there is a tension, and you're right to point to that. Now, in civil society is not in Tilly, because as apparently Tilly said to Sidney Tarrow, he didn't have the time or the will to finish that book, Capitalism, Coercion, Capitalism, State, to include civil society. It would have been there. And so that book is what Sidney Tarrow has written on war and social movements. And that is the other sort of unspoken conversation that I've been holding here. I acknowledge Tilly, not because I see that as the only model for what's going on, or definitely not the model for crowdfunding. I do see it as a model for something that helps us see what the Ukrainian state has been doing, responding to the immediate pressures of warfare, expanding, rationalizing, centralizing, reducing autonomy of state enterprises, increasing taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then the other side of that is the rise of these social movements and the way in which together they govern. Because together they produce what the sociologist Michael Mann would call infrastructural power, where if the social movements withdraw their consent to be governed, the state actually will not be able to do lots of the things that it's doing. And that is really interesting. The interesting thing about Ukrainian state formation, as I'm sure you're aware, I mean, civil society is key to the shape of the Ukrainian state, not because of some, liberal civic spirit, or maybe also because of that, but because of the way in which it gets involved in the business of governing together with the state. So I don't think we disagree. But yeah, thanks for pointing to those tensions.
I'm Harvey Soden. I used to be a vice president of ABC Television in New York. You mentioned before about somebody, some benefactor who contributed to drones and to funding them. Without revealing who it was, unless you want to or can you tell us what that person's motivation was? How did it interplay with like plausible deniability and with what was going on, let's say, in America and European politics? Thanks very much.
Thanks. I mean, the case in question, and we're not in Britain, so I think I'm freer to speak because I'm not constrained by libel law in quite the same way. But I'm basing what I'm saying on a profile in Wired magazine of a man called Andrei Liskovich, who was a senior executive in Uber Works, and who moved back to, as a Ukrainian and I think American citizen, US American citizen, who moved back to Ukraine after the beginning of the full-scale invasion, and who has been quite keen to advertise what he's doing to the Western press. And what he's been doing is he's become a registered advisor to the part of the Ukrainian armed forces. He has filed under the FARA, Foreign Agents Registration Act in the US, meaning that he's also a US citizen. And he's become one of the many buyers for the Ukrainian military, who does not draw any revenues from the Ukrainian state, opening the questions of what he's doing and how he's funding his trips, but who mediates between the Ukrainian military and the various potential providers of technology. And this man, and I mention him without mentioning his name in the talk, because it's an interesting case of someone who acts as a broker in a similar way to what crowdfunders have done, because he has his own crowdfunding charity, but who also has helped this German military startup, Quantum Systems, with Thiel's investment, to broker a deal between the German government and the Ukrainian government for the provision of around 150 drone systems, quite expensive drone systems that I think the Ukrainian government has paid for. and in that process set up a company that does the kind of the technical support for these drones on the front line, and also channels back the information about the use of these drones. And that struck me as the actually valuable thing that was happening. The provision of these data back to the companies, because this is basically free R&D that's done by Ukrainian soldiers using this technology, and it's captured, and it would have cost millions upon millions of euros in Germany had these drones to be tested in the UK, in Germany. Now, I don't know exactly how that fits into the political dynamics in the US. I mean, we've seen cautious attempts by people like Peter Thiel and Eric Schmidt to invest in venture capitalist funds in Ukraine, but in a very small way, actually, to try and test out these new technologies. What we see more is these new defense disruptors and larger companies like Palantir. They all somehow, they all somehow live in this Tolkien's world of the Lord of the Rings. Palantir and Durail and so on. We've seen their efforts to offer free services to the Ukrainian state from the beginning of the war, supporting the very digital infrastructure of the state, shoring it up, but it's not clear on what terms that happened. I was quite curious to see how they would act with the arrival of the Trump administration, because they were also quite keen supporters of the administration, but that hasn't played out yet. So it's very much a live story that maybe you'd want to cover as someone involved in the ABC. Thanks.
Thanks. Here in the second row.
Hi, my name is Arslan Suleimanov. I'm a master's candidate at Central European University. So first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It's been extremely insightful, but I just want to maybe allow us to take some kind of a macro perspective and go beyond Ukraine and maybe just ponder or think about if this kind of thing is somehow sustainable or, let's say, replicable outside in other societies, especially in Western Europe. So let's say if we are to face a potential Russian invasion of another like NATO country in the Baltics or elsewhere, do you think that like there's potential for civil societies in countries like Germany, for instance, or Austria, where the overall skepticism towards the military and anything related to the military is extremely prevalent, when this kind of thing was not, in my opinion, at least non-existent in Ukraine? So skepticism towards the military, to some extent also what we were discussing before, skepticism towards the capitalist system and all those defense contractors that are primarily US based. So what do you think, how replicable is this and how sustainable in other societies? Thank you.
Luckily, I mean, there's a short answer to that. Thanks for the question. There's a short answer to that. I don't study these societies, so I'm not qualified to answer your question, but I'll still try to do that. Because we've seen that happen before. In the First World War and Second World War, in Britain, for example, there was a social movement supporting the purchase of fighter planes, and sure, that was a world that still had a much more of a stamp of war on it than before. But the anthropologist in me wants to say that people who go through the experience of an invasion, of a war, or those who haven't gone through it and those who haven't tried a war on their skin, don't yet know the powerful forces of nationalism and ideology and of enmity, and what they can do to mobilize, to provide for effective mobilization and to galvanize civil society. So I hope I will never know, but I wouldn't be skeptical about it.
My name is Anatoly Reshetnikov from Webster University. Taras, thank you so much for a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed that. And my question is related actually to the very first question that was asked from the first row, and you partially addressed that, but I would like to push you a little bit further in that direction, if you don't mind. As you are presenting, I had this impression that you are presenting this as a story of harmonious, concerted cooperation between the state and the civil society. You presented this as a mechanism of state building and nation building, but certainly, except everything else, what proliferation of drones presents is a huge challenge for the state's monopoly on the production of lethal weapons, especially the kinds of lethal weapons that are used in large-scale organized warfare. And so in this regard, I just wanted to ask, do you see any concern whatsoever from the side of the state that would be related to that issue?
You mean the Ukrainian state?
Yes.
Well,
if you need like right now, if you need just a 3D printer to make lethal weapon and no longer a huge sort of industrial facility to produce that, it must also be concerning for the state.
No, absolutely, and I see where you're coming from. The problem is, I think there should be a responsible answer to a question like this based on knowledge of the kinds of discussions that are happening in Kyiv. I'm not privy to those discussions. In the policy documents that are read, I do not see any attempt by the Ukrainian state to limit the proliferation of skills, because that is the real thing, right? The proliferation of these kinds of skills, of piloting, of construction, of 3D printing, and in fact, there's quite an opposite process of the state working together with civil society groups and networks in disseminating both skills and the blueprints for the construction of these drones and drop mechanisms and et cetera, et cetera. This would have to be part of any sort of demobilization, disarmament efforts at the end of the war, but I think the blueprint for that should be laid much sooner right now, and I haven't seen those discussions. Drones are not dealt with as a form of weapon in these discussions. There's a talk of trophy weapons. I'm party to discussions about what to do with trophy weapons. There's talk about veteran politics and about the kinds of political or radical political movements that veterans could become involved in, the challenge of welfare provision and social unrest, but not drones.
There was one hand there. Yes, the blue shirt. And then mine. Two more questions coming in then.
Yes, thanks very much. Jeff Arnold, former U.S. State Department and U.S. Army officer, working on non-proliferation actually here in Vienna. So my question is actually about the messaging and the means by which the military units and the crowdfunders are reaching out to the donors to generate the funds to procure. And is that messaging, is the nature of the messaging, portraying the violence directly against the Russian targets, personnel especially? And how is that affecting, is that continuing in the same way as it was 3 years ago? I don't see nearly as many images on my feeds, but I'm not in the conflict zone. And how is that affecting the society as far as dehumanizing the opponent? And does that have implications for conflict termination and how you see the Russians? Thank you.
Can you pass the microphone back, and we'll have the second question, the final question, straight away, so you can answer both.
My name is Karl Krieger, and I work for the European Peace Facility. My question would be about this proliferation in private domain, and you were talking about trading, arms trade. So what about the international conventions? I realize that UK, neither UK nor Ukraine are part of EU yet, but in the EU there's all sorts of treaties and procedures and so on going on. And to me, when I listen to this, I think, what about dual use and ATT and small arms survey and so on? If you could maybe talk about that. Thank you.
Thanks. So quickly, the mobilization of funds for drones does depend on constant change in the forms of messaging, and because people get used to the previous messages, etc., etc. The campaigns have been very innovative, and they have consistently tapped in different ways, not necessarily dehumanizing ways, into this basic political relation that is transforming Ukrainian society. And that's political relation of friend and enemy, right? The enmity of war. You would see large-scale partnerships between Come Back Alive and one of the largest Ukrainian banks, Monobank, advertising the joint crowdfunded campaign in which Santa Claus drones are delivering bomblets to the front line, and with the slogan, "Your plus, your donation, your plus is their minus," right? So that enjoins the participants in these publics to imagine themselves as part of that economy, but also to imagine the war as a kind of economy in the first instance, right? Where what you give is kind of a zero-sum game almost, right? So what you give, or negative-sum game, or whatever, I'm not qualified for that, but basically what you give takes away from the enemy. Different crowdfunders have done it differently. One of the most prominent of them, Serhiy Sternenko, has been among those at the forefront of what you'd call dehumanization. I don't see dehumanization as necessarily a political concern for these crowdfunders, for the obvious reasons, right? But that is really one of the less pressing concerns for them in the present, because the war is up to a point existential, and it is about maintaining this kind of challenge right now, right? As for the second question, this kind of, this basically returns me to the point where I started with this UN conference on lethal autonomous weapon systems, which does focus on autonomy, but really addresses the broader set of, or raises the broader set of concerns about proliferation of the platforms that could become autonomous, because we see that there is a process of development, right? I mean, the proliferation of non-autonomous drones is in Ukraine speeding up the innovation of autonomous systems. And I think the reason in which the Ukrainian troops and crowdfunders could innovate in these ways has been because whatever they were procuring, and most of the stuff they were procuring, has not been regulated, and they've been really successful at circumventing the dual use item restrictions regulations imposed locally by Poland and sometimes by Ukraine, and also that have been imposed by China. And I think that there needs to be a broader discussion about the regulation of civilian drones and civilian technology that is seen as hobbyist and something that's done for pleasure, as potentially a dual-use technology to be used in warfare. But that discussion is something to happen after this talk and maybe after the wine that we'll have. But thanks.
Excellent idea. Time for the wine and cheese, where we can carry on this discussion, which has been really a thought-provoking discussion, Taras. Thanks to the intensity of your research. I've really found it very interesting indeed. So everyone, please join me in a round of applause for Taras Fedirko.
Thank you very much.